Spanish moss hung from the ancient oaks like funeral curtains, trailing in ragged gray veils that swayed with every humid sigh of the Louisiana air. It was late afternoon in the summer of 1855, and the Bogard plantation had gathered itself into a single, cruel spectacle around the wooden gallows at the far end of the yard. The sky was a washed-out blue, but the atmosphere felt the color of old bruises, heavy, thick, and tight with something worse than heat. A crowd of enslaved men, women, and children stood in strained silence, pressed together like shadows at the base of the hanging tree. They had been ordered here. This was not a gathering of their will. Overseers on horseback circled them like wolves, rifles in hand, whips coiled and ready, making sure every pair of eyes saw what was about to happen. No one spoke above a whisper. Some didn't dare to breathe too loud. On the rough wooden platform above them, a boy stood with his hands bound behind his back, a coarse rope around his neck. His name was Baptiste. He was 14 years old. At the edge of the crowd, a woman stood utterly still, as if carved from the same dark wood as the gallows itself. Her name was Marie Lavo. She wore a plain, faded dress, patched at the elbows and hem, a headscarf tightly wrapped around her hair. To a stranger, she might have looked like any other enslaved woman on the plantation. But anyone who truly looked at her would have seen the difference. The depth in her eyes, the iron in her posture, the coiled silence that felt less like submission and more like stored thunder. Marie watched her son standing on the platform with his ankles bare, feet planted square. His shoulders shook only once, barely noticeable, as the breeze stirred his shirt. The rope brushed his cheek. His lower lip trembled for a moment, but he lifted his head and stared out at the crowd, searching until his gaze found hers. They did not dare to speak aloud, mother and son, but something moved. Between them all the same, something older than words, older than slavery, older than the white house that loomed behind them like a smug monument to stolen wealth. The accusation was simple. Baptiste had stolen an apple. The truth was worse. He had taken that apple not for himself, but for his younger sister Celeste, who had been burning with fever for 3 days, unable to hold down anything except fruit. He had crept into Master Bogard's prized orchard, slipped a single apple into his pocket, and turned to run. That was all. No fire set, no tool broken, no blood drawn. Just one apple taken by a desperate boy trying to soothe his sister's suffering. But on this plantation, the apple weighed more than his life. Near the front of the crowd, on a raised wooden platform of his own, Master Claude Bogard stood with a posture that tried to imitate nobility and only achieved swollen arrogance. He was a thick man, slick with sweat despite his fine linen shirt and tailored waistcoat. A fob watch gleamed at his waist. His pale hands rested on a cane he did not need, a prop for his imagined importance. Around him stood 12 overseers, each one a different shape of cruelty. Some looked bored, some satisfied, some uneasy enough to glance at the gallows and then at the ground. Together, they made 13. 13 men who had stood in judgment over a boy who weighed less than the saddle on any of their horses. "Let this be a lesson to every slave on my land," Master Bogard boomed, his voice carrying across the yard like the bark of a false god. "Theft will not be tolerated, not by man, not by law, not by the Almighty. Property is property. Those who violate the rights of a property owner will face the consequences, regardless of age, regardless of excuse." His words seemed to press down on the crowd like another kind of rope. No one moved. No one cried out. A few mothers clutched their children tighter. A few fathers looked at the dirt and imagined their own sons standing where Baptiste stood now. Marie did not bow her head. She watched the line of the rope, the grain of the wood, the dust on her son's bare feet. Her heart beat with such force that she could feel it in her fingertips, but her face remained calm, too calm. Only her eyes betrayed her, burning with a fury that had not yet found a shape. On the platform, the boy lifted his chin. "Mama," Baptiste called, his voice clear and unexpectedly strong. It cut through the hot, heavy air like a bell. One of the overseers shifted, annoyed, but no one silenced him. Not this close to the end. Every head in the slave crowd turned slightly, as if the sound of his voice gave them permission to look up again. Marie stepped forward, just a fraction, enough for him to see her clearly. "Take care of Celeste," he said, each word pressed out from a heart pounding with terror and courage together. "Tell her I love her. Tell her." The apple was sweet. The last sentence almost broke something in the crowd. A woman near Marie covered her mouth to hold back a sob. A man clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white, then quickly relaxed them before an overseer could notice. Marie's lips parted, but no words came. There were no words for this. The hangman moved behind Baptiste. A hand reached for the lever. For one strange, suspended moment, the whole world seemed to hesitate. The wind stopped. The moss went still. A mockingbird on a branch above the gallows fell silent mid-note. The plantation held its breath as if even the earth knew what was about to happen and recoiled. Then the lever dropped. The trapdoor slammed open beneath Baptiste's feet. His body fell. The rope snapped tight with a crack like breaking wood. The sound echoed off the white columns of the big house and rolled out across the fields where cotton plants stood like mute witnesses. It was over in a heartbeat. A boy's life reduced to a single, brutal jerk. A few of the overseers nodded to one another with tight satisfaction, as if a chore had been completed. Master Bogard adjusted his cuffs and turned slightly, already bored with the spectacle. To him, this was nothing more than an example, a necessary cruelty to maintain the machinery of his world. The enslaved crowd did not move until they were ordered to. For a moment, they simply stood, eyes fixed on the body that swayed gently in the heavy air. Baptiste's head tilted to one side, his bare toes pointed at nothing. Marie did not cry. Not yet. Her eyes did not leave her son's face. The world around her seemed to recede. The mutter of overseers, the creak of saddles, the thick smell of sweat and dust and fear. All of it blurred and thinned until there was only the gallows, the rope, and the boy she had brought into the world with pain and love and promises she hadn't been allowed to keep. The overseers began to bark orders, shoving the crowd back toward the quarters. Whips cracked in the air, not to strike, but to remind. The enslaved men and women began to move in shuffling lines, their steps slow, some glancing back with eyes full of silent horror and helpless rage. Marie did not move. An overseer rode closer, frowning. "You heard the order," he snapped. "Back to your cabin, woman." She did not look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on her son's feet. "Let her be," another overseer muttered under his breath, a sliver of unease in his eyes. "It's her boy. Give her a minute." Minutes, on this plantation, were granted or denied at the whim of white men. Today, by some careless mercy, they allowed her this one. Slowly, when the crowd had thinned and the dust began to settle, Marie stepped forward until she stood directly beneath the hanging body. The shadow of her son's dangling form fell across her shoulders like a cloak. She reached up, her hand trembling only once, and brushed her fingertips against his bare foot. His skin was still, warm. That was when her grief moved aside, clearing a space for something older, darker, and infinitely more focused. Marie Lavo came from a line of women who had carried more than chains across the ocean. Her mother and grandmother had smuggled knowledge in their songs and bones, in whispered prayers and coded stories, knowledge of herbs and spirits, of crossroads and graveyards, of the thin places where the living and the dead could reach for each other across the veil. On this plantation, she had hidden that power beneath a mask of obedience. Now, the mask cracked. The warmth in her son's foot was fading. So was the last of her hesitation. 13 men had condemned this boy. 13 men had stood, watched, agreed, and allowed their hearts to harden around the idea that a child could die for an apple. 13 men had believed themselves untouchable, covered by law and custom, and the false comfort of their own whiteness. Marie's fingers curled around Baptiste's foot, as if she were claiming what little remained of him. Inside her, a vow took shape, not spoken yet, but forming with the firmness of stone sinking into river mud. It was precise. It was cold. It had the feel of something that had been waiting for generations to be born through her mouth. Above them, The moss stirred again, brushing the gallows beam like ghostly fingers. A mockingbird began to sing in a strange, low cadence that sounded almost like a dirge. The air grew heavy with a presence that did not belong to any man standing in that yard. Soon, Marie would give that vow words. Soon, the spirits that listened at the edges of the world would hear her count. 13 men, 13 days, 13 deaths. And the plantation that had killed her son would learn that a mother's grief, married to ancient power, could become the most dangerous force in Louisiana. When dawn returned to the Bogard plantation, it did not feel like morning. The light that spilled across the cane fields was pale and listless, as though even the sun were reluctant to touch this place. Dew clung to the cotton like sweat on frightened skin, and the mist rising from the bayou seemed to crawl rather than drift. The gallows still stood at the far edge of the yard, its rope swaying gently in the early breeze, a reminder of the lesson Master Bogard had meant to teach. Life resumed, but not as before. The enslaved people moved through their tasks with the mechanical obedience that centuries of fear had taught them, yet every motion felt haunted. Each time a hoe struck soil, each time a door creaked, someone flinched. The world had shifted in a way they could not name. Something had been taken, but something else, unseen, waiting, had arrived to fill the hollow it left behind. From the balcony of the great house, Claude Bogard surveyed his domain with a mixture of irritation and pride. He was a man who measured worth in acreage and obedience, a merchant of human labor who believed himself a custodian of divine order. The events of the previous day had disturbed his sleep, though he would never admit it. The hanging of a boy should have been routine, a swift correction to preserve discipline. Instead, the air on the plantation had thickened with whispers that even he could feel. The slaves worked, yes, but they worked too quietly. He preferred them singing music dulled their minds and hid the sound of chains. This silence made him uneasy. Inside the house, the world of the masters carried on as if sealed behind glass. His wife, Eugenia Bogard, played gentle waltzes on the pianoforte in the drawing room, her lace sleeves brushing the keys. 2 daughters arranged flowers cut from the garden camellias that wilted faster than usual in the heat. The household servants moved among them in soft-soled shoes. Invisible, efficient, Marie Lavo was one of them now. After the execution, Master Bogard had ordered her transferred from the fields to indoor duty. It was an act of mock generosity meant to disguise punishment, a daily reminder of her son's death, performed within arm's reach of the man who had condemned him. Marie worked in silence, her face expressionless as she dusted the carved mahogany chairs or polished the silver tea service. She rarely looked up, but nothing in that house escaped her. Notice the tremor in Eugenia's hands when she thought of the gallows, the small, nervous glances the overseers exchanged when they came to report, the faint metallic taste in the air each time the wind blew in from the direction of the hanging tree. The plantation was beginning to sour, and she could smell the rot before anyone else dared to name it. Beyond the house stretched the quarters, a long row of cabins sagging under the weight of years and humidity. Each was built from rough cypress boards, roofed with warped shingles that leaked when it rained. Smoke from the cooking fires drifted low over the rooftops, carrying the smell of corn mush, ash, and sorrow. At night, the cabins glowed faintly from within small islands of warmth. In an ocean of darkness, the people who lived there whispered prayers over every meal, prayers that were half African and half Christian, words that crossed the boundaries between worlds. They whispered, too, about Marie. She stood right under him, old Isaac said in a rasping voice, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. Didn't cry, didn't scream, just touched that boy's foot and looked up like she was talking to someone none of us could see. They say she come from the Lavo women out of New Orleans, replied Letty, a seamstress with nimble fingers and a sharp tongue. Her grandmother could call spirits with a drumbeat and a drop of blood. They say even the priests feared her. Hush that talk, warned another, glancing toward the door. You want the patrollers to hear you? But fear could not silence curiosity. The story of Marie's stillness at the gallows spread faster than rumor because it carried the flavor of prophecy. People needed to believe that justice existed somewhere beyond the reach of the whip. And so, as they worked in the fields under the scorching sun, they whispered to one another when the overseers' backs were turned. Maybe the spirits had seen what was done to that child. Maybe the blood soaked into the dirt would not rest. By the second day, even the overseers sensed that the air was wrong. Samuel Briggs, the head overseer, rode his horse through the rows with exaggerated swagger, cracking his whip more often than usual. "Keep your pace," he barked, but the sound of his own voice seemed to fall flat. The animals were restless. The dogs refused to go near the gallows. At night, the horses stamped and snorted in their stalls, eyes rolling white. Briggs told himself it was coincidence, swamp vapors, imagination, but he began to carry a flask of rum to steady his nerves. The other overseers, men like Frost, Cole, and Porter, laughed at him when he mentioned it. "You letting the darkies' ghost tales spook you, Sam?" Frost said, his grin as sharp as his whip. "Ain't no spirits here, just heat and bad whiskey." Yet even as they laughed, none of them would walk past the hanging tree after sundown. Each man found an excuse to take the long way around. They told themselves it was prudence. Marie watched them all with the patience of a hunter. She moved between the quarters and the big house like a shadow, collecting scraps that no one else valued. A lock of hair from Briggs's comb, a button from Frost's waistcoat, a thread from Master Bogard's pillow. She did it quietly, without hurry. Vengeance, she knew, was an art that required preparation. At night, when Celeste slept beside her, she would take out the small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboard and run her fingers over its lid, whispering to it as one might to a sleeping child. The box had belonged to her grandmother, and inside it waited the tools of old power: bones, herbs, ashes, tiny bottles of oil, and a single coin blackened with age. Sometimes she dreamed of her ancestors, women standing in circles beneath African moons, their faces painted with ash and light. They never spoke, but they watched her with approval. And when she woke, the dreams left behind a humming in her veins, like the memory of distant drums. In those hours before dawn, Marie felt her grief take shape, sharp and cold as iron. Meanwhile, the plantation's daily life ground on under the weight of its own routine. Bells rang at sunrise, at noon, at dusk. Hands bled, backs bent. Cotton filled the sacks. From the veranda, the Bogard family measured productivity in pounds and profit. They thought themselves the axis of the world. Yet beneath their polished shoes and marble floors, the earth had begun to stir. Every injustice leaves an echo, and echoes accumulate until they become a tremor. The Bogards could not hear it, but the soil beneath their feet was remembering. Eugenia Bogard noticed it first in her garden. The roses that had once bloomed in obedient symmetry now wilted unevenly, as though some unseen hand were plucking their life away petal by petal. She blamed the servants for neglect and sent Marie to replant them. Marie knelt among the thorns, her hands deep in the earth. When she pressed her palm flat against the soil, she felt it pulse, faintly, as if breathing. She smiled to herself. The smallest movement of lips. The land was listening. That evening, as twilight settled over the plantation, a fog rose from the bayou and crept toward the fields. It was thicker than usual, smelling faintly of iron. The men returning from the fields muttered that it looked like smoke from a distant fire. Master Bogard watched it from his balcony, uneasy, without knowing why. The fog rolled over the gallows first, coiling around the beam and rope like a caress. Then it spread toward the quarters, seeping under doors, curling into every corner of the plantation as night fell. By midnight, the entire estate lay under a shroud. Marie did not sleep. She sat on the floor of her cabin beside the open wooden box. Celeste, half awake, watched her mother trace patterns in the dust with the tip of her finger. "What are you doing, Mama?" the child whispered. "Talking to the earth," Marie murmured without looking up, telling it what happened. Celeste shivered. "Can the earth hear you?" Marie's eyes flicked to the window where the fog pressed against the glass like breath. "It can," she said softly, "and it remembers better than people do." Outside, a single note of a mockingbird cut through the mist. Then another answered it, far away, until the night filled with the eerie echo of birds that should have been sleeping. In the big house, Eugenia Bogard woke from a dream of drowning and could not shake the feeling that someone was whispering her name. In the stables, the horses kicked at their stalls, nostrils flaring. Samuel Briggs rose from his bed coughing, his throat raw and dry, and reached for the flask on his table. The rum burned going down, but the tightness in his chest did not ease. By morning, the fog had lifted, but the plantation did not look the same. The colors seemed muted, the air thick with a metallic scent. The overseers blamed the weather. The doctor blamed malaria. The preacher blamed sin. Only Marie knew what it was. The veil between worlds had thinned, and the spirits had begun to gather. From her place in the servants' quarters, she watched the white men ride out to the fields, their laughter forced, their faces drawn. She saw the nervous way they avoided each other's eyes, the way Master Bogard's hand trembled slightly when he raised his coffee cup. She felt pity for none of them. They had sown terror for decades. Now they would harvest it. The order they had built their cruel, precise machine of obedience had begun to rust. Its gears would grind for a little while longer, but the corrosion had already set in. That night, Marie lit a single candle and whispered to the small wooden box, her voice steady and low. 13 men, 13 days. The flame flickered as though answering her. Somewhere far away, the mockingbird began its song again, soft, slow, and mournful. The plantation slept uneasily under a sky the color of old blood, unaware that its reckoning had already begun. By the time the moon waxed to half its face, the Bogard plantation had sunk into a rhythm of dread. Work continued, cotton still needed picking, animals feeding, floors scrubbing, but there was a strange hesitancy in every movement, as if the air itself resisted motion. The enslaved people rose before dawn as always, yet even the most hardened overseers could sense that something unseen now shared their mornings. At first, Master Bogard ignored it. He refused to believe that anything, beyond discipline and commerce, could shape his world. When his wife Eugenia mentioned the garden's strange silence, no crickets, no songbirds, he waved her off with a frown. "Nonsense. Nature doesn't take sides," he said. "And even if it did, the Almighty stands with order." He said it with the conviction of a man who spoke to reassure himself, not anyone else. But order had begun to crumble in ways he couldn't quantify. The plantation bell cracked on the 4th morning, after Baptiste's hanging, its iron tongue splitting clean in half. Briggs cursed when it happened, but the sound, an abrupt, hollow chime, lingered in the minds of everyone who heard it, as though it had announced the death of something far older than metal. That same night, in the servant quarters, Marie Lavo knelt on the packed earth floor, her candle's flame trembling as if it recognized what she was about to do. She had spent days collecting what she needed, piece by piece, with the patience of a woman who understood that true vengeance was never rushed. In her small wooden box lay the beginnings of retribution. Clay gathered from the riverbank where her ancestors' blood had mixed with the mud, moss from the gallows tree, a sliver of cloth from Master Bogard's shirt collar, and a fragment of rope she'd cut secretly from the hanging beam itself. Each item was small, harmless to any eye that lacked her sight, but together they formed the foundation of something far more potent than any weapon man had ever forged. Celeste stirred in her sleep on the straw mat beside her. The girl's fever had eased since the night of the hanging, though her dreams were restless. Marie brushed her daughter's cheek gently before returning to her work. She began to knead the clay, humming under her breath. The song had no words, only syllables older than English, carried from the shores of Dahomey and whispered down through the generations. The air thickened as she sang. A faint heat rose from the earth, carrying the scent of damp moss and copper. Shadows lengthened around her, though the candle remained steady. When the figure was roughly shaped, she pressed the piece of Bogard's cloth into its chest. Then she pricked her finger and let a single drop of blood fall into the hollow she'd carved for its heart. "Papa Legba," she whispered, her voice low and reverent. "Open the way. Baron Samedi, keeper of graves, I offer you this clay to mold as you see fit. Urzuli Dantor, mother of the broken, lend your strength to mine." Each name was a key turned in an invisible lock. The air shimmered faintly, and a soft tapping sound echoed against the cabin wall 3 times, as though someone outside were knocking gently to be let in. Marie didn't flinch. She knew the spirits often arrived quietly, respectful of the living who remembered their names. When she finished, she wrapped the doll in black cloth and tied it with twine, sealing it. Inside her wooden box, it pulsed faintly beneath her hands, warm as flesh. The first of 13. Outside, the night stretched heavy and soundless. A storm was building in the distance, its thunder rumbling like a slow heartbeat. The next morning, the first omen arrived. Samuel Briggs came down to breakfast in the overseer's quarters, with his face pale and his hands shaking. He dreamed of suffocating, he told Frost and Cole. In the dream, he'd been standing in the yard, unable to breathe, while the mockingbirds sang from the gallows tree. He woke, gasping, throat burning as though a rope had grazed it. "You're drinking too much, Sam," Frost said with a forced laugh. "You let the heat and that rum twist your head." But Briggs only rubbed his neck and muttered, "Felt too real." Marie served coffee to Master Bogard later that morning, moving quietly through his study. He barely noticed her. His desk was piled with letters, accounts to balance, debts to settle, but the quill trembled in his fingers. He dropped it once, cursed under his breath, and pressed a hand to his temple. "Sleep is a fragile thing these days," he murmured, half to himself. Marie didn't answer. She only poured his coffee, her expression blank. But inside, something stirred. The first thread of her vow had tightened. That evening, when she returned to her cabin, she heard the sound she'd been waiting for, a faint rustle in the rafters, like dry leaves stirred by invisible hands. She lifted the box. The black cloth inside quivered once. A ripple of energy passed through the room, flickering the candle flame blue. In that instant, she knew the curse had awakened. Over the next 2 days, the plantation's routine began to unravel in small, unsettling ways. Tools went missing and reappeared in strange places. The horses refused to leave their stalls. The dogs whined at shadows and clawed the ground as if trying to dig something up. The enslaved workers exchanged wary glances, murmuring prayers beneath their breath. The overseers, desperate to reassert control, lashed out harder than before. Frost beat a field hand for moving too slowly. Cole ordered double shifts under the sun, but their fury rang hollow. The gestures of men trying to convince themselves they still held dominion. Marie kept to her work, outwardly obedient, inwardly calm. Each night, she returned to the cabin and added another piece to her silent army. A button from Frost's coat, a thread from Cole's handkerchief, a nail paring from Briggs, taken from the floor of the barber's shop where he'd gone for a trim. Each object became a bridge between the living and the dead. As she shaped each doll, she felt the power gathering like storm water behind a dam. The ancestors were listening. The air grew thicker, charged with a hum that only she could hear. On the 6th night, she dreamed of her grandmother. The old woman appeared beside the river, her skin shining, like obsidian under the moon. "Do not rush it," the spirit said. "Vengeance must be measured, not spilled. 13 days, child. One for each name that cursed your blood." Marie bowed her head. "I understand." When she awoke, the room smelled faintly of river mud. The candle, long extinguished, had left a curl of soot on the wall, shaped like a handprint. Meanwhile, Samuel Briggs's cough had worsened. By mid-morning, he could hardly speak. His voice came out in hoarse gasps, each breath scraping his throat raw. The doctor from town examined him, found no infection, and shrugged helplessly. "Maybe his throat's closing from swamp fever," he suggested. But the other overseers noticed something strange. Briggs's skin bore faint red marks circling his neck, as though from a rope that wasn't there. That night, he couldn't sleep. The air in his cabin felt thick and cold. Every creak of the floorboards made him start. He reached for his flask, but his fingers trembled so badly that the rum spilled down his shirt. Just before dawn, he heard the faint sound of a woman humming, distant but clear. A low, mournful tune, the same rhythm that had haunted his dreams. He stumbled from his bed, shouting into the dark, "Who's there?" No answer, only the echo of the song fading into silence. When morning came, Marie was at her duties in the kitchen when the first screams tore across the yard. She stepped to the window just as a small crowd formed outside the overseer's quarters. Samuel Briggs lay face down in the dirt, his hands clutching his throat, his mouth open in a silent gasp. His eyes were wide, fixed on nothing. The doctor declared it a seizure, maybe a heart attack, but those who saw his face whispered that it looked like he'd been strangled without rope, without hands, without mercy. Master Bogard ordered the body buried immediately. "No sense in frightening the others," he said. But fear didn't need help. It spread on its own, faster than wildfire. That night, Marie opened her box again. The first doll was cold and still. Its work was done. She placed it aside and began shaping another from the same clay. Her movements slow, deliberate, almost tender. As thunder rolled over the bayou, she pressed a lock of Marcus Cole's hair into the fresh clay and whispered to the unseen, "Number 2. The storm outside broke then, hard rain pounding the roof like drum beats. Inside, Marie smiled faintly, her face lit by candlelight. Justice, at last, had begun to walk the earth. The morning after Samuel Briggs was buried, the plantation held its breath. The usual sounds, whip cracks, hammering, shouted orders had fallen away, leaving only the restless hum of insects and the groan of the wind through the moss-hung trees. The field hands moved slower than usual, glancing often toward the overseer's quarters where the earth above Briggs's grave still looked raw and unsettled. It was as if even the soil refused to accept him. Master Claude Bogard stood on his veranda, clutching a cup of coffee gone cold. His wife, Eugenia, lingered in the doorway behind him, her face pale beneath her lace cap. She had not slept since the night Briggs died. "You can't tell me that was natural," she said softly. "No man just stops breathing without cause." Claude didn't look at her. "He drank himself to death," he said flatly. "Rum and swamp air, that's all." But he didn't believe it. He could still see Briggs's face in his mind, the bulging eyes, the stretched mouth, the purpled marks circling his throat. When the doctor suggested it was a seizure, Claude had agreed quickly, almost too quickly, desperate to pin the event to something explainable. He needed the illusion of order, even if it rested on lies. By noon, a damp heat had settled over the plantation like a fever. The men worked, stripped to their waists, sweat glistening on their backs as they bent to the cotton. Marcus Cole rode among them on horseback, whip coiled in his hand, barking orders louder than necessary. He was young, barely 25, but already carried himself with the arrogance of someone who thought cruelty was proof of strength. He had been closest to Briggs, drinking with him in the evenings, sharing stories of punishments as if they were war victories. Yet now, with Briggs in the ground, Cole's laughter rang too high, too hollow. Every time he passed the gallows tree, his eyes flicked toward the rope hanging limp from its beam. Once, he thought he saw it sway, though there was no wind. "Superstition," he muttered, spurring his horse faster. "Nothing but old wives' tales." But that night, he dreamed. In his dream, the gallows stood at the edge of the bayou, its wooden frame black against the moonlit water. A mockingbird sat on the beam, singing the same low, mournful tune Briggs had once mentioned. Then he saw the boy, the one they'd hanged, standing ankle-deep in the water, eyes wide, lips blue, holding an apple that dripped crimson like blood. "You took my life," the boy said, his voice both child and echo. "Now the water will take yours." Cole woke, gasping, his sheets damp with sweat. The sound of dripping water filled his ears, though the room was dry. He rose, heart hammering, and went to the basin to splash his face. But when he looked into the mirror, he froze. For an instant, just an instant, he saw another reflection beside his own, the faint image of a boy with a rope-marked neck staring at him through the glass. He spun around. Nothing, only the whisper of night, cicadas through the shutters. The next morning, Cole said nothing of the dream. He laughed with the others at breakfast, though his hands trembled when he reached for his cup. He ordered the field hands to the riverbank to clear brush for new irrigation ditches. "We'll work till sunset," he declared. "The master wants." Those lines finished this week. Marie Lavo was in the kitchen that morning, scrubbing the great copper pot when she heard the overseer's laughter outside. It had a nervous pitch to it, like men whistling past a graveyard. She dried her hands and glanced toward the window. Across the yard, Marcus Cole swung into his saddle, his boots polished, his expression defiant. But Marie's eyes weren't on his face. They were on the small bundle tied at her belt, a strip of black cloth, wrapped tightly around a clay doll still damp from last night's work. The previous evening, after burying the first doll in the ashes of her hearth, she had started the second. This one had been shaped with clay from the bayou itself, sticky and cold to the touch. Into it she had pressed the lock of Cole's hair and a button from his jacket, both stolen quietly by one of the house servants. Around the doll's neck, she had tied a thread dipped in river water. When she whispered the final prayer, the candle flame had turned blue, and the air filled with the scent of wet earth and decay. Now, as Cole rode toward the water, Marie felt the same heaviness in the air that she'd felt before Briggs died, a stillness so dense it seemed to muffle sound. The mockingbird outside the kitchen window gave a sharp cry, almost human. Down by the bayou, the laborers worked in uneasy silence. Cole barked at them from horseback, urging them into the thick reeds where snakes slithered and the mud sucked at their boots. "Faster!" he shouted. "You move slower than ghosts!" The sun climbed higher, burning the mist away until the air shimmered like glass. Sweat streaked the men's faces. The smell of decay from the river made the air thick and nauseating. Around midday, Cole dismounted to drink. He knelt by the water's edge, cupping his hands. The river ran dark and sluggish, reflecting the sky like tarnished silver. He leaned closer, then froze. Something was moving beneath the Minas surface. It looked like fabric at first, black cloth, undulating just below the waterline. Then he saw a shape within it. Small, human, and disturbingly familiar. Two hollow eye sockets stared up through the ripples. Cole staggered back, choking on air. "Christ!" he shouted. The field hands looked up, startled, but none approached. Cole blinked hard, and the vision was gone. Only the river, calm and still. He cursed under his breath, splashing his face with handfuls of water. "Too much heat," he muttered. "Too damn much." But as he straightened, a cool wind brushed past him, impossible in that suffocating humidity. It carried the faint scent of clay and candle smoke. That afternoon, dark clouds began to gather over the bayou. Thunder rolled low, distant. The workers hurried to finish the ditch, stealing glances at the sky. Cole ordered them to keep working. "Rain or not," he snapped. "You'll finish before you eat." The first drop of rain fell on his hand. It was warm, thick. He glanced down and froze. The droplet was red. Another fell, then another. The ground around him speckled with crimson. "Blood!" one of the workers screamed. Cole's horse reared, shrieking, and bolted toward the trees. The men scattered, some falling to their knees, others fleeing up the slope. Within seconds, real rain followed sheets of water pouring down in torrents, washing the red away. But Cole was already stumbling backward, slipping on the wet mud, eyes wide with panic. He ran blindly through the storm, the river roaring behind him. The ground gave way under his boots. He fell, sliding down the embankment into the black water. For a moment, he surfaced, coughing, grasping for a root, but something caught his ankle. He kicked, gasped, fought. Then he was pulled under. The men found his body the next morning, floating face down among the cypress roots. His hat was gone, his eyes open, his expression twisted in shock. There were no wounds on him, no signs of struggle except the raw scratches on his arms where he'd clawed at the mud. "The fool drowned," said Frost, though his voice wavered. "Didn't know how to swim in his own river." But those who had seen him the day before whispered otherwise. They said the water had risen to claim him, that something had dragged him down. Marie heard the news while sweeping the hall outside Master Bogard's study. She paused only for a heartbeat, then continued her work. her broom strokes slow and steady. That night, when the house slept, she went to her cabin and placed the second doll beside the first in her box. The clay figure had cracked clean through the chest, as though something had burst from within. She smiled faintly and began gathering materials for the next. Across the plantation, fear took root. 2 overseers, dead in 2 days, both without clear cause. The slaves whispered of spirits walking the earth. The masters muttered about coincidence, though their eyes betrayed them. Even the dogs refused to approach the quarters after sunset. In his study, Master Bogard stared out the window toward the bayou, where lightning flickered above the trees. He thought he saw movement in the distance, a woman's silhouette by the water's edge, still as a statue, watching the house. But when he blinked, she was gone. He poured himself another drink and muttered to the empty room, "It ends here. Whatever this is, it ends here." But outside, beneath the rain, Marie Lavo whispered to the wind, 2 down, 11 to go. And the spirits, listening from the trees, began to hum. For 3 days after Marcus Cole's drowning, the Bogard plantation lay beneath a veil of trembling silence. The rain had passed, yet the air remained heavy with its ghost, a damp, metallic weight that clung to skin and thought alike. Nothing dried. Not the laundry strung between the cabins, not the sweat that gathered at every neck, not even the fear that soaked into every conversation before it could form words. The slaves whispered of signs. A baby born that week came into the world with a small red mark around its throat. A mule refused to drink from the bayou, braying so wildly that its handler had to shoot it. The mockingbirds sang every night now, repeating the same mournful pattern of 3 notes, always ending on a dissonant fall. People swore it sounded like laughter, forced through tears. Master Bogard refused to acknowledge any of it. He strode through the halls of his great house with a stubborn posture that looked like authority but smelled of desperation. He wrote letters to neighboring planters asking for advice, disguising his fear in the language of practicality. Recent misfortunes, unexplained deaths, morale among the Negroes dangerously high. Few replied. Those who did suggested prayer, or stricter discipline, or perhaps a visit from a priest. But no one volunteered to come. It was said that the Bogard estate had turned unlucky, that something foul lingered in its soil. To distract himself, Bogard increased the pace of the work. He ordered longer hours, doubled the quotas, and punished any who lagged. But even he could see that fear made the labor sluggish. Men moved like sleepwalkers. Women flinched at shadows. The rhythm of production faltered, as though the heartbeat of the plantation itself had gone irregular. Among the overseers, only 3 still carried themselves with confidence: William Frost, James Porter, and Thomas Nash. Frost was the loudest, a tall, broad man with a ruddy face and eyes as pale as spilled milk. He had always believed in force above all else. Where others saw whispers and spirits, he saw laziness that needed fire to correct it. He had been the one to invent the punishments that used heat iron rods, scalding water, branding hooks. He called it the fire of discipline. On the evening of the 3rd day, Frost sat with Porter and Nash in the prize overseer's quarters. The 3 men huddled around a bottle of rum like soldiers around a fading campfire. The lantern light threw long, jerking shadows across the walls. "I'll tell you what's happening," Frost said, slamming his cup down so hard that rum sloshed onto the table. "It's rebellion in the air. They're planning something, using the dark to scare us off. Briggs and Cole were careless, that's all. They let the fear get to them. You can't let fear in, it burns faster than alcohol." He chuckled at his own metaphor, but the sound was brittle. Porter shifted uncomfortably. "Burns," he echoed. "That's rich, coming from you. Half the hands still carry your marks, and they work because of them." Frost snapped. Then he leaned back, lowering his voice. "You'll see. Tomorrow I'll light the forge again. Let the smell of iron chase the devils out. No spirit can stand the heat of fire." That same night, Marie Lavo sat cross-legged in her cabin. The small wooden box opened before her. 12 dolls rested inside, half-formed, unfinished faces of vengeance waiting for breath. In her lap lay the next one, a figure sculpted from clay that had been baked at the edge of the forge when no one was watching. She had waited for the fire to cool, then mixed its ashes into the clay, binding Frost's essence to his own element. Around the doll's neck she wound a thread soaked in oil and a single hair pulled from his comb. "Fire answers fire," she murmured. Her voice trembled like a song held between teeth. She pricked her thumb, let a drop of blood fall on the doll's chest, and whispered in the old tongue. The candle flame beside her guttered, then flared, stretching tall and thin, blue at the center. For a heartbeat, the walls glowed with strange symbols, lines, and curves that seemed to move when she blinked. Then the light steadied, and the room was still again. At dawn, Frost awoke before the others, eager to prove that his talk of bravery was more than bluster. He strode to the smithy behind the stables, his boots leaving wet prints in the dew-soaked grass. The forge had gone cold overnight. Its coals lay black and lifeless. He shoveled in fresh charcoal, pumped the bellows, and soon the first tongues of orange began to lick upward. The heat felt good. It cleared the fog in his head. He worked with manic focus, hammering stray pieces of iron for no reason except the noise. By mid-morning, the flames were roaring, and sweat poured down his arms. "See," he muttered to himself. "No ghosts here." But the longer he worked, the stranger the fire became. The flames changed color, first a deep gold, then a fierce white that stung his eyes. He backed away, coughing from the heat. The air around the forge shimmered, warping like a curtain in a strong wind. "Too much draft," he said aloud, though the wind was still. He reached for the bellows to close them, and a sudden hiss cut through the air. Sparks exploded upward, showering his face and arms. He cried out, stumbling backward, but the heat followed him. His sleeve had caught just a spark at first, then a flare that raced along the fabric as if the fire had been waiting for his flesh. Outside, a field hand carrying water saw Frost burst from the smithy, his shirt ablaze. He screamed a sound so raw it seemed to tear the air itself. Men came running, some with blankets, others with buckets, but the flames would not die. Each time water touched them, they flared higher, brighter. By the time the fire went out, there was almost nothing left of William Frost but ash and the twisted frame of his belt buckle. The forge itself remained untouched. The tools lay neatly arranged, the walls unscorched. Only the spot where he'd stood bore the black outline of a man burned into the earth. That night, Bogard paced the veranda, while the remaining overseers argued in hushed voices. "3 in as many days," Porter said. "This isn't coincidence," Bogard snapped. "Enough of your cowardice. The slaves are playing tricks, that's all. We'll root out whoever's behind it. Every cabin will be searched." But when he ordered the searches, the men hesitated. The idea of stepping into the quarters after dark filled them with dread they could not explain. Finally, Nash agreed to lead the effort. He took 2 men and a lantern, but after an hour they returned, pale and shaken. "We heard things," he stammered, whispering, like from under the floors. And Porter's name, someone was saying Porter's name. Bogard's temper cracked. He struck Nash across the face and shouted for everyone to return to work. But his voice, once thunderous, now carried no weight. Even he could feel the eyes of the night upon him. In the kitchen, Marie pretended not to hear the commotion. She scrubbed the same section of floor until her hands ached. Inside, her chest throbbed with quiet, triumph, and sorrow. Each death brought justice closer, but it also deepened her isolation. The other slaves regarded her with awe now, not companionship. Children who once smiled at her skirted away. Power had a price, and hers was loneliness. Still, she could not stop. The work was unfinished. That evening, after the house went still, she returned to her cabin and lit her candle again. The third doll, Porter's, waited, half-formed beside the others. She traced the cracks in the clay of the first 2 dolls and felt the hum of something ancient pulsing beneath them. It was like touching the heartbeat of the earth. 13, she whispered. 13 will balance the scale. Outside, thunder rolled again, though the sky was clear. The wind rustled through the moss, and somewhere near the gallows, the mockingbird began its song, a melody that rose and fell like the counting of time itself. By morning, the plantation smelled faintly of smoke, though nothing burned. The slaves crossed themselves when they passed the forge. The overseers spoke in clipped tones, avoiding each other's eyes. Eugenia Bogard refused to leave her room, claiming she could hear footsteps in the hallway at night, bare feet that left wet prints fading into nothing. And Claude Bogard, sitting alone at his desk, finally allowed a single unspoken thought to form. What if this was punishment? Not from the slaves, nor from any earthly rebellion, but from something older, something that remembered every lash, every cry, every child who never saw another dawn. He poured himself another drink and stared at the window until the glass seemed to ripple with the reflection of flames. He blinked, and they were gone. In her cabin, Marie closed the lid of her box, her hands trembling but steady enough to work. She did not smile. The satisfaction she felt was not joy but a cold, necessary peace. Justice was not mercy. It was balance restored. Outside, the dawn broke over a sky tinged red at the edges. The color of clay and blood mingled together. The plantation stirred uneasily beneath it. Somewhere beneath the moss and magnolia, the spirits shifted again, awake now, fully, whispering among themselves as they prepared for the next death that would darken the Bogard name. The day after William Frost's death, the Bogard plantation moved as if the air itself had thickened into syrup. The forges lay cold, the iron smell still lingering like an accusation. Nobody dared sweep the blackened patch where he had burned. They stepped around it, eyes lowered, as though crossing that space would draw fire to their own flesh. The slaves whispered prayers into their hands before touching any metal, muttering, "Fire remembers." Claude Bogard summoned his remaining overseers to the big house at dawn. He wanted the meeting to feel official, orderly, a declaration that he was still master of his world. But the sight that gathered around his mahogany table only deepened his unease. 4 men remained out of the original 12, and each one looked more like a ghost than an enforcer. James Porter's eyes were bloodshot from sleeplessness. Thomas Nash had lost weight, his cheekbones sharp as blades. Henry Walsh's left hand trembled uncontrollably. Robert Kane, the whipmaster, carried the smell of liquor as if it were a shield. "Enough of this nonsense," Bogard began, pounding the table. Briggs drank himself to death. Cole drowned like a fool. Frost burned because he mishandled the forge. Accidents, every one of them. No one replied. The silence pressed against the windows. "Order will be restored," Bogard went on, forcing confidence into his voice. "You'll double patrols at night. I want the slaves accounted for, every movement watched. If anyone's spreading stories—" "It isn't stories, sir," Walsh interrupted quietly. "It's something else." Bogard turned on him. "What are you implying?" Walsh swallowed, hard. "The dogs, they won't go near the gallows. They snarl at the air. Last night I saw footprints in the dirt by Frost's grave. Bare feet, small, like a child's." Bogard's fist clenched. "You think ghosts walk my land? I don't know what walks it," Walsh said, eyes downcast. "But something does." The room fell still again. The plantation clock ticked, measured, relentless. Bogard dismissed them with a curt gesture, pretending composure. When they filed out, he remained at the table, staring at the polished surface until his reflection blurred. He looked older, smaller. That afternoon, Porter found him in the yard, staring toward the slave quarters. "Sir," he began carefully, "we could send for a priest. A blessing, maybe. Do you think God's forgotten this place?" Bogard snapped. "He sees everything we do." Porter hesitated. "Maybe that's the problem." Bogard struck him across the mouth so quickly the sound startled them, both. Porter touched the blood on his lip and walked away without another word. In the quarters that night, Marie Lavo sat before her small altar. The candlelight flickered against the wooden box that now held 4 cracked dolls, each one a tiny tomb. She had not eaten all day. The work drained her in ways even she hadn't expected. Every life, the spirits claimed, left an echo inside her. a hollow that filled with equal parts grief and dark satisfaction. Celeste slept fitfully nearby, whispering through dreams. Marie brushed sweat from her daughter's brow and murmured, "Soon, mon bébé. Soon it will be finished." She drew out the next doll. It was James Porter's turn, the man who broke horses and men with equal cruelty. For him, she mixed the clay with hair from his stable's brush and dust from the hoofprints of a stallion that had once trampled a runaway. She shaped its limbs slowly, deliberately, whispering, "Spirit of the wild, remember the whip that cut your back. Spirit of the earth, remember the hands that spilled your blood. Justice, come gentle as breath, strike hard as hooves." When she finished, she pressed the doll's tiny legs into the soil beneath her floorboards and left it half buried, as though ready to gallop. The candle flame flared blue again. The smell of horses filled the room. By dawn, Porter awoke to the sound of frantic whinnying from the stables. He pulled on his boots and rushed outside, still half drunk from the rum he'd used to numb his fear. The sky glowed gray with early light, fog curling around the paddocks. The horses reared against their stalls, eyes rolling white, their breath steaming in the chill. "Easy!" Porter shouted, grabbing a rope. "What spooked you?" A thunderclap answered from a clear sky. The largest stallion, Blackjack, snapped its tether and lunged. Porter tried to dodge, but the animal struck with terrifying precision, hooves crashing into his chest. He flew backward, the sound of splintering ribs echoing like breaking boards. The other horses screamed and began kicking their stalls. By the time men arrived, Porter lay twisted in the dirt, his body grotesquely bent, his throat crushed. Blackjack stood calm beside him, snorting softly, as if the fury had never been his own. Marie heard the commotion from the kitchen. When a boy burst in to tell the cooks that another overseer was dead, she closed her eyes. The sound of hooves still pulsed faintly in her ears. That evening, as the plantation buried Porter beside the others, thunderclouds gathered once more, though no rain fell. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating 13 cypress trees that lined the path to the gallows. Eugenia Bogard refused to step outside. She sat in her parlor clutching a rosary, whispering prayers that melted into sobs. "Claude, please," she begged when her husband passed the doorway. "Let the priest come. Something wicked's loose here." He stopped, his eyes hollow. "There's no wickedness here but what men make," he said, and left her in the dark. The next morning, a new kind of fear settled in, a silent, resigned kind. The slaves had stopped singing altogether. Even the field hands who once hummed spirituals under their breath now moved in eerie quiet. They knew what was happening, and though many prayed for mercy, none dared interfere. Some left small offerings at the edge of the gallows tree. Cornmeal, rum, bits of cloth. The overseers saw these and smashed them angrily. But by nightfall, more appeared. The spirits were being fed. Thomas Nash, who prided himself on being practical, began to starve himself out of terror. Food turned to ash in his mouth. He worked by day and locked his cabin door at night, though the lock's keyhole glowed faintly red in the dark. On the 6th day after Frost's death, the slaves found him dead in his bed, skin sunken, stomach caved in as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. His supper sat, untouched, beside him, still warm. When the doctor examined him, he frowned. "Starvation," he said, baffled. "But look at his hands, there's grain under his nails. He'd been eating up to yesterday." No one questioned further. They buried Nash quickly, without sermon. That night, Henry Walsh, who trained the dogs, heard them whining. He went to the kennels with a lantern, muttering, "Quiet, damn you!" But the animals crouched at the far end, ears flat, eyes fixed on the open yard behind him. The wind shifted. The lantern flickered. In its unsteady light, he saw the faint outline of footprints in the mud, bare, small, leading toward the gallows. "Who's there?" he shouted. The dogs began to bark wildly. He turned, lifting the lantern, and froze. All along the fence posts, 13 mockingbirds had gathered, their eyes shining like drops of mercury. They sang in unison, the same mournful, descending tune. The lantern shattered in his hand. Darkness swallowed him whole. At dawn, They found him torn to pieces behind the kennels. The doctor claimed the dogs must have broken loose, yet every hound still lay chained, sleeping peacefully. Claude Bogard stood over the body, trembling with rage he could no longer disguise. "Enough!" he roared to the gathered men. "Whoever's doing this, slave, spirit, devil, it ends tonight." He ordered the militia from town. By evening, 15 armed men arrived, their rifles gleaming. They searched the quarters, upended barrels, ripped open bedding. They found nothing except fear. When they reached Marie Lavo's cabin, she stood quietly by the door, Celeste clutching her skirt. Her eyes, calm and deep as river water, met Bogard's for a long moment. "Search it," he ordered. The soldiers tore through her belongings. They found no weapons, no letters, no charms. The small wooden box remained hidden beneath the floorboards. One of the men paused as if hearing something, a faint hum, but when he looked down, there was only dust. When they left, Marie knelt and pressed her palm to the floor. The hum answered, low and steady. The dolls pulsed faintly under her touch, as if hearts beat inside their hollow clay. Outside, Bogard paced the veranda while thunder gathered again. He'd wanted proof of rebellion. Instead, he'd found a silence that terrified him more than open revolt. The slaves moved like ghosts, eyes lowered, lips muttering words he didn't understand. His overseers dwindled by the day, and the militia's presence brought no relief, only the sense of being watched from every shadow. That night, lightning split the sky over the bayou, illuminating the gallows tree. For a brief second, Bogard thought he saw shapes hanging there, not one body, but many, swaying gently in the stormlight. He blinked, and they were gone. Only the rope moved, creaking softly in the wind. In her cabin, Marie whispered her next vow. 8 names remained. Each would fall as the moon waned. Justice was not yet finished. The scales still tipped under the weight of a child's death. 13 for one, she murmured. 13 for love. Outside, rain began again, not the gentle rain of life, but the steady, endless fall that washes away everything except memory. By the 12th day, the Bogard plantation no longer felt like a place where men lived. It felt like a wound that refused to close. The air smelled of mildew and fear. The fields, once loud with shouts and whip cracks, now lay hushed, stalks of half-picked cotton swaying in the wet wind. The overseers' quarters stood empty, except for the faint echo of their vanished occupants. Dogs no longer barked. Even the crows had fled. Inside the great house, curtains stayed drawn, though it was midday. Claude Bogard wandered the halls with a pistol tucked into his belt, his boots leaving muddy prints across the marble floors. He muttered to himself, counting under his breath. 13 men, 13 days. Each morning, another grave, another silence. He'd stopped pretending it was coincidence. Whatever stalked his plantation followed rules older than any he could command. The 12th grave belonged to Sean Alley, the last of the young overseers. Bogard had tried to protect him, stationing him in the parlor under armed guard. Yet the boy had died anyway. His heart stopped in front of 6 witnesses, his face as peaceful as if he'd fallen asleep. No wound, no struggle, just the sudden stillness of a candle snuffed between fingers. The soldiers had crossed themselves, whispering, "This is no sickness of the flesh." That night, even the militia refused to stay. One by one, they slipped away down the muddy road, leaving their rifles stacked by the gate. By dawn, Bogard and his family stood alone among the ruins of their authority. Eugenia refused to leave her bedroom. She lay in her nightgown, clutching a Bible to her chest, lips moving ceaselessly. "She's done. This," she whispered whenever her husband entered. "That woman, the one with the eyes like river stones. She's brought hell here." Bogard didn't answer. He hadn't the strength to argue. The image of Marie Lavo haunted him, the quiet composure, the unblinking calm when the searchers had ransacked her cabin. He'd seen power before, the kind that came from land and law. But this was something else. This was the power of conviction, of grief sharpened into purpose. He poured himself another drink and watched the rain streak the window panes. The reflection that stared back looked 20 years older. His hands shook so badly the glass rattled against his teeth. In the slave quarters, Marie was awake long before dawn. Celeste slept beside her, breathing softly. Around them the air trembled with anticipation, as if the whole world knew this was the final day. The small wooden box lay open on the floor, its contents almost complete. 12 cracked figures and one waiting. Space. Marie lifted the last lump of clay from its cloth wrap. This one she'd prepared from soil taken secretly from the graveyard behind the house, earth mixed with ashes from the gallows rope itself. She kneaded it slowly, rhythmically, each motion a prayer. 13 for one, she murmured, the last for the first. From a hidden pocket she drew a thin scrap of white linen embroidered with gold thread torn from the pillowcase of Claude Bogard himself. It still carried the faint scent of his tobacco and sweat. She pressed it into the clay's chest, sealing it there like a diseased heart. Her voice deepened as she chanted the old words. They rolled through the small room like waves, the sound not quite human anymore. The candle flame turned the color of blood. Outside, wind rose from nowhere, rattling the shutters. The mockingbird began to sing, that same mournful descent of 3 notes repeated endlessly, as if marking time for the dead. When the doll was finished, Marie placed it at the center of the others. For a moment, the air vibrated, then everything went still. The power that had been gathering for nearly 2 weeks compressed into silence so thick it felt physical. She exhaled and whispered, "Let it be done." The sun never fully rose that day. A strange half-light smothered the plantation, neither dawn nor dusk. The fields shimmered with a fine mist that clung to every surface. Bogard dressed himself in black, though he didn't know why. Perhaps to look like authority again. Perhaps to attend his own execution. He moved through the silent halls, calling for servants who no longer answered. The kitchen was empty, pots cold. The parlor smelled faintly of wax and mold. When he reached the front door, he hesitated. Beyond the veranda, the world looked blurred. The trees shrouded as if wrapped in gauze. The gallows stood faintly visible at the far edge of the yard, a dark shape against the pale mist. For the first time in his life, Bogard was afraid of open ground. He poured one final drink at his desk, ignoring his wife's distant prayers upstairs. Then, hearing movement behind him, he turned. Marie Lavo stood in the doorway. She wore the same plain dress she'd always worn, but something about her seemed changed. The air around her shimmered faintly, like heat over a forge. Her eyes were calm, unreadable, reflecting neither malice nor pity, only inevitability. "Marie," Bogard said, his throat dry, "you shouldn't be here." "I have always been here," she answered softly. "You just never saw me." He stepped back, his hand brushing the pistol at his belt. "You think I'm fool enough to believe in witchcraft? You killed them somehow, poison, tricks." "I killed no one," she said. "The world simply remembered what it owed." "Stop speaking in riddles," he snapped, but his voice broke. "You hanged a child for an apple," she said, taking one step closer. "You made me watch. You told us that property was property, that law was law. But there are older laws, Master Bogard. You have met them now." He raised the pistol, his hand trembling. "Stay back." She didn't move. The gun fired. The sound cracked through the house like thunder, but the bullet never reached her. It stopped mid-air, dropping to the floor with a faint metallic ring. Smoke curled upward, and the scent of sulfur thickened. Bogard stumbled backward, choking. The temperature in the room plummeted. His breath came out in white clouds. Frost bloomed across the glass panes despite the humid air. "What are you?" he whispered. "I am what you made," Marie replied. "I am every mother who buried a child and lived long enough to feel the earth remember." The shadows around her began to move. They gathered into shapes tall, indistinct figures that filled the corners of the room. The air pulsed with the sound of distant drums, soft at first, then rising, until the walls themselves seemed to throb. Bogard fell to his knees. "Please," he begged, voice cracking. "I'll free them all. I'll end it. Just let me live." Marie shook her head slowly. "Freedom bought with blood is still blood. The debt must be paid in full. The room darkened further until only the faint glow of the hearth remained. Then even that went out. For a heartbeat, there was absolute blackness. In that blackness came voices, hundreds, maybe thousands, whispering in a language that had crossed oceans. They did not speak words he understood, but the meaning sank into him like cold water. Judgment. When the light returned, the spirits stood revealed, translucent, shimmering, their faces both human and something more. In their midst a smaller figure appeared, a boy of 14 with eyes like pale smoke. Baptiste, Marie breathed. Her son looked at her and smiled, radiant and terrible. Then he turned to Bogard. "You remember me," he said, simply. Bogard tried to rise but found he couldn't move. Invisible hands pressed him down. His heart hammered wildly, then began to slow. Every breath felt heavier, as though a rope tightened around his throat. Marie watched, tears cutting silent paths down her cheeks. "Let him feel what you felt, my son," she whispered. "Let him know." The invisible noose drew tighter. Bogard clawed at his neck, eyes bulging. The pistol clattered to the floor. The spirits circled closer, their voices swelling into a chant that shook the foundations of the house. "Upstairs," Eugenia screamed, though she couldn't say why, only that the walls seemed to breathe. Candles exploded into smoke. Downstairs, Bogard fell forward onto his knees, choking, his vision filled with flashes, his son playing on the veranda years ago, the first slave he'd purchased, the gallows rope twisting in the wind. He tried to speak, to beg again, but no sound came. The last thing he saw was Marie's face, serene as stone, her eyes reflecting the firelight that wasn't there. Then the rope snapped, though no rope hung in the room, and his body went limp. The temperature rose again. The frost melted from the windows. The shadows faded, taking the whispers with them. Only Marie remained, standing over the fallen man. Baptiste's spirit turned toward her, his expression softening. "It's done," he said. She reached for him, but her hand passed through air. He smiled a child's smile, full of peace, and then dissolved like smoke in sunlight. Marie stood alone for a long time. Then she knelt beside Claude Bogard's body and closed his eyes with trembling fingers. "The count is finished," she said quietly. "The scales are even." Outside, the storm broke at last. Rain poured down in relentless sheets, washing through the open doorway, carrying ash and dust into the earth. The mockingbird's song changed, no longer mournful, but slow, steady, almost restful. When morning came, the plantation was silent. When the storm finally spent itself, the Bogard plantation lay under a washed-out sky, pale as bone. The rain had scoured everything, dust from the road, ash from the forge, blood invisible to any eye but memory. Puddles pooled in the low places, reflecting broken snippets of the great house, the gallows, the gnarled oak trees draped in tattered moss. It looked less like a working estate now and more like the wreck of a ship run aground on land. Word traveled fast. It always did, even when no one seemed to be moving. By mid-morning, every man, woman, and child in the quarters knew. Master Claude Bogard was dead, found alone in his study, no wound on him, the pistol at his side unfired, his face twisted into a final expression of terror that made even the doctor step back. "Stroke," the man from town said weakly, "or his heart. Shock from all that's happened." But those who had seen death too many times knew better. No stroke. Carved a pattern like that, the slightly parted lips, as though he'd seen something his mind refused to accept. The faint bruising at the throat, shaped like fingers that were not there. The slaves did not cheer, not openly. Centuries of caution did not fall away in a single day. But there was a change in the air, subtle yet undeniable. Backs straightened, eyes lifted from the ground. The silence that had ruled for 13 days began to crack, letting through small, disbelieving sounds, half laughs, half sobs, like the first bird song after a long winter. In the cabin she shared with Celeste and 2 other women, Marie sat very still on the edge of her straw pallet. The wooden box that had held the dolls lay open and empty at her feet. The clay figures were gone, dissolved back into the earth they'd come from. Only faint smears of dried ash and her own blood remained inside, like fingerprints on a tombstone. Celeste watched her mother's face with wide, uncertain eyes. "Is it over?" she asked. The question hovered between them like smoke. Marie listened, really listened, to the space around her, to the creak of the cabin's beams, the drip of rain from the eaves, the distant murmur of voices rising from the quarters. For the first time in weeks, the air no longer vibrated with the low hum of restless spirits. The drumbeat beneath everything, the one she'd felt in her bones, had quieted. "It's over," she said at last. Her voice was hoarse, worn thin. "The counting is done." Celeste exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for 13 days. She scrambled forward and wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, pressing her face into the coarse fabric of Marie's dress. "Then we can leave?" she whispered. "We can go away from this place?" Marie's hand moved automatically to her daughter's hair, smoothing it back from her forehead. The thought of leaving had flickered through her mind many times in the past. Nights, a small, fragile flame. With Bogard dead and his overseers in their graves, the chains that bound the plantation together had come loose. Already, she knew, men and women were making plans in hurried whispers, routes to the nearest swamps, rumors of Union lines somewhere to the north, names of safe houses where runaways might find shelter. "Soon," Marie said, though the word tasted complicated. "Some will go, some will stay. The world outside, it is changing, but it is not safe yet. Not fully. You'll come with me," Celeste said, as if it were a promise she had the power to enforce. "Wherever we go." Marie hesitated. Her gaze drifted to the floorboards beneath which she had buried fragments of clay, threads of cloth, drops of her own blood, to the wall where, faint and almost erased by smoke, strange patterns still lingered from candlelight that had burned too bright, to the window through which she could see the hanging tree, standing crooked and stubborn against the fading storm. This place was soaked with memory, with her son's last breath, with her grandmother's lessons, with the vengeance that had reshaped its fate. To walk away from it felt like turning her back on a grave that still needed a watcher. "Maybe, for a while," she said softly, which was the closest she could get to a clear answer. Outside, movement stirred at the big house. A carriage arrived from town, bringing Bogard's lawyer and a distant cousin, pale, stiff-backed men who stepped gingerly around the mud, their faces pinched with distaste. They entered the house and closed the doors firmly, as though that alone could keep out the lingering echo of screams. Papers were read, documents signed, decisions made in low voices, but the law of ink and seal felt very small in the face of what had happened. What mattered on the plantation now was not who owned it on paper, but that the invisible net of fear binding hundreds of lives to one man's name had been torn apart. That afternoon, the new temporary master ordered all slaves gathered in the yard. He stood on the veranda steps with a rolled document in hand, cleared his throat, and tried to speak with authority. But the weight of the house behind him, the empty windows, the unseen footsteps made his words falter. "Until such time as the estate can be placed under proper management," he began, "you will continue your assigned duties. There will be no more executions without legal review. And—" He broke off as a mockingbird landed on the gallows beam above his head and began to sing that same descending tune. The sound cut through his speech like a knife. The crowd of enslaved people shifted, their eyes drawn upward. The man swallowed hard. "And, any attempts at rebellion will be dealt with according to law." The threat sounded hollow, even to him. He dismissed them quickly. No one saluted. They simply turned away, moving back toward the quarters in a slow, deliberate wave. Marie did not join them. She remained at the back of the yard, arms folded, gaze fixed on the gallows. When the others had gone, she walked forward until she stood once more beneath the beam where her son had died. The rope still hung there, frayed now, its fibers darkened by rain and time. She reached up and touched it. This time, her fingers did not tremble. The wind stirred the moss, carrying with it the faintest sound of laughter, not cruel, but light. Marie lifted her face to the sky and closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw Baptiste as he had been before all of this. Barefoot in the yard, chasing Celeste in circles, his grin wide enough to split his face. "I kept my promise," she whispered. 13 for one. 13 for you." The mockingbird fell silent. For a long moment, there was only the soft rustle of leaves. Then, from somewhere deep beneath her feet, she felt a gentle thrum like a heartbeat, slow and steady. The land itself, exhaling. That night, the cabins along the row glowed brighter than they had in years. Fires burned in every hearth. For the first time in memory, laughter rose unhidden from the quarters, quiet at first, then bolder, rolling from door to door like a contagion of relief. Old Isaac told the story of the 13 days in a whisper that nonetheless carried into the humid air. Children leaned forward, eyes wide, as he spoke of dolls and spirits and a mother who had turned grief into a weapon sharper than any whip. "Remember this," he told them, tapping a bony finger against his knee. "They thought they owned the land, the house, the people, even the breath in our lungs. But there's things no man can own. Love, memory, an ancestor's promise. Those live where no master's hand can reach." Some wept as they listened. Some smiled through their tears. In her cabin, Marie did not join the storytelling. She sat by the window, staring at the moon as it climbed through ragged clouds. Celeste lay with her head in her mother's lap, half asleep, murmuring fragments of dreams. "You're a legend now," one of the other women said quietly from her pallet. There was awe in her voice, but also a trace of fear. "They'll be telling your story when your bones are dust." Marie shook her head. "They'll be telling Baptiste's," she said. "I want them to remember his name more than mine." "Both," the woman insisted. 13 dolls, 13 days. The mother who cursed a whole plantation. There ain't a soul from here to New Orleans who won't hear it." Marie said nothing. Her hand moved absently in Celeste's hair, fingers tracing circles. She knew the woman was right. Stories were already taking shape in the air, bright and fluid as smoke. With every retelling, details would change, names shifted, numbers tangled, miracles added where simple cruelty had been enough. But the core would remain. That on this land, in this year, the old gods had answered when a slave woman called. In the weeks that followed, people began to leave. Some slipped away alone, vanishing into the swamps at night with nothing but a bundle of clothes and a whispered blessing. Others left in small groups, their footprints washed away by morning rain. The temporary master tried to organize patrols, but the men he hired rarely stayed long. They claimed the road felt wrong after dark. One insisted he'd seen lights moving in the trees where no lanterns burned. The plantation's new owner never materialized. Letters went unanswered. Debts mounted. The big house sagged a little more with each passing season, shutters banging loose, paint peeling in long, curling strips. Marie stayed. Not forever, not at first by choice, but the land held her in ways she could not easily name. It was her son's graveyard and his monument, her grandmother's altar and her own battlefield. Leaving it felt like tearing out a piece of herself and leaving it unguarded. Years turned like pages. The war came. Distant thunder carried on rumors before it ever arrived in gunshot or flame. Armies clashed and flags changed, and one day someone rode down the road shouting that slavery was finished by law. On the old Bogard plantation, most of the enslaved were already gone by then. Only a handful remained, those too old, too tired, or too rooted in memory to run. Marie was among them. She lived in the same cabin, though now no one ordered her to. She tended a small garden of herbs and wildflowers, walked the overgrown rows where cotton no longer grew, and spoke often to the spirits that lingered beneath the oak trees. People came sometimes, from nearby towns or from far away, wanting to see her. "You're the one, aren't you?" they would say in hushed voices. "The woman with the 13 dolls. Marie would look at them for a long moment before replying. Sometimes she nodded. Sometimes she said, "Stories grow like vines. Be careful which ones you grab hold of." But when they asked what really happened, She always began the same way. "They killed a child for an apple," she would say. And the world decided it would not forget. The great house never knew another true owner. Families tried to move in after the war, lured by the promise of land cheapened by tragedy. None lasted more than a few months. They complained of footsteps in the halls at night, of doors opening without wind, of a mockingbird that sat on the chimney and sang the same 3 notes over and over until nerves frayed. Eventually, no one tried anymore. The house stood empty, its windows hollow, its porch sagging. Vines crept up its pillars like fingers reclaiming stolen things. Children from nearby settlements dared each other to run up and touch its door, then sprint back before the spirits noticed. In the yard, the gallows tree slowly rotted, its wood softening, beam sagging, but no one ever cut it down. It remained, gray and twisted, a warning and a memorial in one. When Marie died in 1870, she did so quietly, in her bed, Celeste's hand clasped in her own. Her last words were a whisper the girl had to lean close to hear. "Baptiste, Mama is coming home." After they buried her beneath the same oak that had once borne her son's weight, the mockingbird's song changed again. It became softer, almost gentle, as if singing a lullaby rather than a dirge. The story of Marie Lavo and her 13 dolls did not die with her. It traveled on wagon wheels and whispered prayers, in songs sung under breath in churches and around kitchen tables. Over time, the details blurred, but the heart remained. That there was a place in Louisiana where a plantation had been cursed and emptied, where injustice was answered not by courts or laws, but by a mother's love sharpened into a blade. They called it many things over the years: the cursed house, the 13th place, the gallows plantation. Travelers avoided it at night. Those who passed nearby swore they could feel eyes on them from the trees. Some, if they listened very closely on still evenings, claimed they could hear the faintest echo of a woman's voice riding the wind, counting softly, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 13, and underneath the counting, like a steady drumbeat older than any nation's flag, there pulsed a single, enduring truth. Love remembers. The earth remembers. And sometimes, when the balance tips too far toward cruelty, the world remembers how to answer. By the time the century turned, the Bogard plantation had ceased to be a working farm. Nature had swallowed its boundaries, and the earth, indifferent but watchful, reclaimed what men had once carved from it. The cotton fields grew wild with reeds and briars. The old quarters sagged under vines, their doors half sunk into the soil. The great house still stood, but barely a pale, ruin with its roof peeled open to the sky like the split shell of a long-dead beast. Inside, furniture lay moldering beneath dust and bird nests, and the grand staircase bowed under its own rot. Only the portraits remained dry, their painted eyes still sharp, as though the dead refused to let go of their claim. People who passed along the overgrown road sometimes caught glimpses of it through the trees. They said the windows looked like eyes, watching. At dusk, a faint golden light sometimes flickered behind the broken shutters, though no one had lived there in decades. When storms came, lightning never struck the house directly, yet the sky above it glowed in strange hues: green, violet, or blood red, depending on who told the tale. Local children dared each other to approach the gate, where the iron hinges were rusted in the shape of open mouths. They'd creep through the tall grass until they saw the oak tree still standing near the old gallows. Its branches leaned low, thick, with Spanish moss that dripped like funeral veils. No one ever touched it. It was said the bark beneath the moss bore a mark in the shape of a hand, small, like a woman's. When older folks told the story, they said the curse of the plantation was not one of anger, but of memory. "It's not vengeance that haunts that land," they'd whisper. "It's remembering. The kind of remembering that won't let the living lie about the past." Every generation retold the tale in its own way. In some versions, Marie Lavo was a saint, a conjure woman chosen by the spirits to free her people. In others, she was a warning proof that grief could burn so fiercely it scorched everything around it. But no one ever denied that something had happened there, something no logic could explain away. 13 men dead in 13 days. The plantation emptied, a legacy that defied time. By 1905, a small church had been built on the edge of the property by freedmen's descendants. They called it Mount Zion of the River, and its congregation grew from families who had once labored under Bogard's whip. They planted gardens in the shadows of the old cotton fields, letting flowers rise where bones had been buried. At every service, someone would say a prayer for the mother who called the spirits, and the choir would hum the tune of an old Creole song that had no written words, only the rhythm of mourning and defiance. On warm nights after revival meetings, the elders sat on the church steps, fanning themselves and talking about the days before freedom. Their stories always circled back to Marie. Old Isaac's grandson, a man named Joseph, once said, "They tried to forget her, tried to let the house fall and the tree rot, but the land won't forget. Every time I plow that soil, the air hums like a heartbeat. She's still watching, making sure no one builds a gallows there again." The others nodded, some with reverence, some with unease. For them, Marie was not a ghost to be feared, but a guardian to be respected. A reminder that even the most powerless could shape the world with faith sharpened by pain. By the 1920 seconds, the tale of the 13 Dolls had spread beyond Louisiana. Folklorists from the north came asking questions, their notebooks filled with curiosity disguised as scholarship. They wanted dates, names, proof. They walked the land with cameras and measuring tools, searching for rational explanations. None of them lasted long. The first refused to spend the night after hearing footsteps outside his tent, though no tracks marked the wet ground. Another caught a fever that lingered for months after returning home. A third claimed that while sketching the old house, he'd seen a woman standing in the upper window, her face pale and her eyes glowing faintly like embers. When he looked again, the window was empty. They published their findings anyway, dismissing the supernatural elements as superstition. Yet, even in their dry language, an unease lingered between the lines. The persistence of this legend, one wrote, suggests a cultural need to believe in justice beyond law, an emotional retribution that human systems fail to deliver. He never returned to Louisiana. As the century turned again, the world around the plantation changed, but the house remained untouched. Highways carved through nearby towns, factories rose, and the bayou grew quieter as industry drained its wetlands. Still, the old road to the Bogard estate stayed narrow and crooked, lined with trees that seemed older than time. Hunters avoided the area. Locals still crossed themselves when driving past at night. Those who ignored the warnings told strange stories afterward. One young man claimed he'd seen small figures like dolls made of clay scattered in the mud near the gate. When he tried to pick one up, it crumbled in his hand, and a thin whisper had brushed his ear. 13 for one. A woman from New Orleans who fancied herself a medium spent a night there with her companions in 1962. She came back at dawn, pale and shaking, refusing to speak. A week later, she left the state entirely. Her assistants said that sometime after midnight, she'd begun speaking in a language none of them recognized. Her eyes rolled white, her voice not her own. The locals just nodded when they heard. "She shouldn't have gone calling where the spirits already listen," one said. By the 1980 seconds, the plantation was officially listed as abandoned federal property. Plans to develop the land fell through repeatedly. Surveyors reported equipment failures, missing maps, and unexplainable malfunctions. The documents were quietly shelved. But every so often, someone new would come: historians, ghost hunters, curiosity seekers. They'd walk through the ruined house, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through dust thick as fog. They'd find old things left behind: a rusted iron key, a scrap of embroidered linen, a single child's shoe buried in the dirt near the fireplace. Sometimes, they said, the air smelled faintly of apples. Most visitors never stayed long. Those who did reported dreams too vivid to dismiss: dreams of a woman standing under a gallows tree, her face lit by candlelight, whispering to something unseen in her hands. When they woke, the smell of smoke lingered, though no fire had burned. The legend of the 13 Dolls became part of Louisiana's haunted folklore, told alongside tales of swamp ghosts and river witches. But among the descendants of the enslaved families, the story held a deeper truth. It was not a ghost story, it was a genealogy. In small towns from Baton Rouge to Biloxi, old women traced their bloodlines back to the ones who lived through the curse. They kept jars of river clay on their windowsills, wrapped in black cloth, to keep away bad men. They taught their daughters the prayers that were not quite Christian, not quite African, but something older, songs that mixed mourning and triumph in the same breath. Celeste Lavo, Marie's daughter, lived to be an old woman. She moved to New Orleans in her 20s, married a freed carpenter, and raised 3 children. Yet she returned every year on the anniversary of her brother's death. She'd bring a basket of apples, always 13, and leave them at the base of the oak. "So the spirits don't forget kindness," she'd say. When she died in 1899, her children buried her beside her mother. The next morning, the apples were gone. Now, more than a century later, the land remains quiet. The gallows tree has finally fallen, its trunk hollowed by termites, but even in death it seems to hum faintly when the wind passes through. The house is little more than a shell, but its shadow stretches long at sunset, always darker than it should be. On certain evenings, when the air is thick and the crickets pause their song, those who live near the bayou swear they can hear counting carried on the wind. Not loud, never loud, but clear, as though whispered directly into the ear. 1, 2, 3, always stopping at 13. The people who hear it don't run. They bow their heads. Some whisper a prayer, others a thank you. For them, Marie Lavo's vengeance long ago transformed into protection. The same power that once destroyed now guards the forgotten graves and the living descendants who bear her name. In Louisiana folklore, they still tell her story at crossroads and in candlelight. Preachers use it to remind their flocks that divine justice needs no courthouse. Poets write her as a symbol of endurance. Children repeat her name in playground dares. But beneath every version lies the same heartbeat, the same truth that has never faded. That love, when driven to its furthest edge, becomes something immortal. That injustice, when met with silence, calls forth its own reckoning. That a mother's vow can echo across centuries, reshaping the land itself. And somewhere, on nights when thunder murmurs over the bayou, a mockingbird still sings its strange, descending tune. Those who know the story claim it isn't a song of sorrow anymore. It's a warning and a promise in one. 13 for one, 13 for justice, 13 for love that refused to die.